And I said I couldn't believe how professional somebody could be when they want to goof on me. So why don't we get started here? That was our beautiful intro. Um, we want to get started today. Thank you everybody for joining. I want to invite everybody. This is our first in a number of series of online Zoom events that we're putting together. I've done many of these before in the past, but for the Mr. Local History Project, this is one of the more modern ones that we're doing. I just figured I'd do a little prep up for the next one that we're doing, because we got a couple coming up right in a row. We've got another one coming up on Friday night, which is one called, the title is Haunted Roots, and it's produced by a guy named Matt Ryan, who's a Basking Ridge and Burnersville resident, and he will be joining us Friday night for an hour. And this has actually turned into quite a controversial Zoom session, only because some people that have been born and raised in this town haven't really heard this story. Yet all of a sudden, a guy like Matt that picked up a story that he learned as he was growing up here, it ended up getting picked up by Weird New Jersey. And if you know Weird New Jersey, it usually just takes off from there. So Weird New Jersey picked up this story about the Basking Ridge Deviltry, and Matt decided that he would come back and actually try to debunk some of the theories that were put up against this poor tree out in the field over in Liberty Corner, and tie it also to an old farmhouse, a 1790s farmhouse that recently just got tore down. So Matt is going to come online Friday night and do that. You can sign up the same way you did for this one, and we'd be happy to put you in touch with that. In addition, so what we're going to do is we got 1 hour until 8 o'clock. I want to introduce our feature tonight is Fred is a book. Oh, in fact, let me turn on my I'm going to just turn on my Zoom screen here. Let me get my video going. Oh, got it. Okay. I'm going to introduce this book. It's called Jersey Stories. It's Fred Rossi's book here. And if everybody on the video here, we can see Fred. Fred, thank you for coming today. Fred and I had a nice chat the other day. I've read his book. I think it's a fantastic book. For those that want to know a little bit more about Fred, other than I'm sure he'll give a quick introduction to himself, is Fred is also, he's a writer and journalist for over 30 years. He's a writer, actually, for the Westfield Leader and the Scotch Plains Fanwood Times. Extensive research in some of the lesser-known stories. That was sort of the foundation for a calendar that he produced that he can talk a little bit about, which led to his idea with the book. He's a resident of Scotch Plains. This is his first book. I'm very jealous, but I have to tell you, it's a great read, and hopefully we're going to learn a little bit more about some of the stories that Fred has dug up. And I think it's really interesting as well. There's going to be a little bit of local lore in here that actually resonates, I hope, well with the crowd. So with that, I'd like to welcome Fred to the call. And Fred, let's start having a conversation.
Great. Can everybody hear me? Is my voice fine? This is my maiden effort at a Zoom meeting, so.
I can certainly hear you.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you, Brooks, for having me here tonight, and thank you to everybody who's tuning in. I've been locked down here at home for most of the last 7 months, so it's kind of nice to be sort of with a group of people, even if it's only virtually. And yeah, thanks again to Brooks, Mr. Local History, for getting in touch with me a couple of weeks ago and inviting me to talk with you tonight. So I'm hoping by the time we're done here that all of you will have a new appreciation for this often aggravating place we all call home, New Jersey. As Brooks said, yeah, I love history and I love trivia, and despite all the annoyances, I guess I do love New Jersey as well. I was born and raised here, and I've lived most of my adult life here. And it was that love of trivia and history and all things New Jersey that led me back in the 1990s to start collecting bits and pieces of New Jersey trivia. And eventually, 15, 20 years later, I put them all together into this calendar. And the basis of the calendar was that every day contains some bit of New Jersey history and trivia each day of the year. Some of it serious, some of it frivolous. So today, for example, October 28th, in 1664, Indians sold land between the Raritan and Passaic rivers to English settlers who named that area Elizabethtown. And that today encompasses most of Union County as well as some other areas. So, and today is also my grandmother's 118th birthday. So I put that calendar out in 2012 and 2013, and then that was the end of that. Last year, I got the idea to take 20 or 30 entries from that calendar and look into them further and to see if there might possibly be a book in it. And it turns out there was. So after several months of researching and writing, and then a few months of editing and proofreading and taking pictures and laying it all out, my book, Jersey Stories, was published just before Christmas last year. One of the things that struck me as I was working on the book, and even back when I was doing the calendar, were how many firsts have taken place in New Jersey. I'll just run through a couple. You probably know some of these. The first baseball game was played in New Jersey up in Hoboken. And so was the first college football game between Rutgers and Princeton. The first airmail delivery in the country took place in New Jersey, all the way from South Amboy up across the Raritan Bay to Perth Amboy, about a mile away. The first coast-to-coast phone call without the assistance of a long-distance operator took place in New Jersey, and that's in my book. The country's first National Historic Park was established up in Morristown. The first electric lighting system in the United States using overhead wires was installed in Roselle Park in 1883. The first highway traffic circle in the US was down in Pennsauken. And so was the first drive-in movie theater, which is also a chapter in my book. And the country's first automated toll machine was installed not too far from us at the Union Toll Plaza on the Parkway back in 1954. Was that?
Boo, God forbid.
Yeah.
First toll plaza. Still continues to this day. But you forgot the most important one. I got your book up here too. How about this one? The first brewery in America opened in Hoboken in 1642.
That's right.
How about that? That one caught me.
And me too. And of course, the New Jersey was the first place in the country and in the world to be invaded by the Martians. And that happened 82 years ago this Friday down in Little Grover's Mill near Hightstown. And it all unfolded on a Sunday night in 1938, thanks to Orson Welles and his Mercury Theater team on CBS Radio. A mild panic ensued in this area, especially for a few hours that evening, as the Martian invaders made their way north to Jamesburg and then to Basking Ridge and Watchung and Morristown before heading to New York City. Here's a sample from my book of what was going on in New Jersey that night. Police stations in numerous towns and cities were flooded with telephone calls from frightened and panicked residents. Police in Newark received calls from doctors and nurses volunteering their services to those injured by the Martians. New Jersey Bell Telephone said every office in the state was flooded with calls for more than an hour, and the company did not have time to summon emergency operators to relieve the congestion. NBC reported that personnel at the WJZ radio transmitting station in Bound had received dozens of calls from residents living in the area. And the New York Times described one scene in Newark. In a single block, more than 20 families rushed out of their homes with wet handkerchiefs and towels over their faces to flee what they believed was a gas raid. In Caldwell, an excited parishioner ran into a Sunday evening church service and shouted that a meteor had fallen, showering death and destruction, and that North Jersey was under threat. the state police eventually sent out a bulletin stating that the radio broadcast was, quote, an imaginary affair. So I also found some very interesting firsthand recollections from people who were around that night, and it was a very fun chapter to write. As Brooke said, we were talking yesterday about tonight's program, and he told me many of you attending tonight are from Basking Ridge, or at least close by. And he pointed out how my book includes several references to the greater Basking Ridge area. And on the first page of my book, third paragraph, I kind of give a brief review of how North America, and New Jersey in particular, were formed a few 100 million years ago. And then I wrote, some 18,000 years ago, the Ice Age resulted in glaciers that reached down to New Jersey. And as those glaciers retreated, what they left behind were, besides a number of rivers and gorges, Lake Passaic, the Great Swamp, and a great pile of earth and rocks to the west of the Great Swamp Basin that today is Basking Ridge. I was
going to say, which is, for those on this call, and if you're in the area, certainly Leonard Buck Gardens, which is a county park, serves as the base. And I just wrote a piece actually about what is referred to as God, I think it's called Hog Hollow, which is a reference basically to a gentleman farmer whose name was Belcher. And Belcher was an old standing family that actually owned the farm before the Ladds bought the Natterer estate and built their Natterer property up there. So it's really that area, from what they told me was really interesting, is that was part of a 30-mile lake at one time that ran from Basking Ridge over to Far Hills, well, from the Great Swamp to Far Hills, all the way up to Parsippany, and was a lake that was somewhere around 300 feet deep. So
I think I read that too in my research.
It's an impressive place, and the park is beautiful. It's an actual gorgeous park. So certainly go see it if you can.
Yeah.
Hoggy Hollow, there you
go. Yeah, another Basking Ridge related story is the story of William Dayton, who's part of a chapter in the book. He was born in Basking Ridge, and he was the very first vice presidential nominee of the newly formed Republican Party in 1856. An interesting side note, the guy Dayton beat out to win that nomination was a former one-term congressman from Illinois named Abe Lincoln. Then there's the local girl who did pretty well for herself from just up the road in Bernardsville, and that's Millicent Fenwick. At first, I intended to include her in my chapter of firsts, since I erroneously believe she was the first grandmother elected to Congress. But after I talked to her biographer last year, she informed me that Fenwick was not the first grandmother. So instead of dropping her from the book altogether, I gave Millicent Fenwick her very own chapter because of my longstanding admiration for her. I can remember watching the Republican convention in 1976 when President Ford and Ronald Reagan were battling for the nomination. And late one night, there was an important vote on the convention floor on some matter of great importance. Each state for that vote had to cast their vote delegate by delegate. And when the TV showed the New Jersey delegation, I watched as this small and elegant grandmotherly looking lady firmly shouted into the microphone, "Fenwick votes no." And that caught my attention, as did pictures I soon saw of her smoking a pipe. She was called the Katharine Hepburn of politics, and she was quite independent in her political views, and she was certainly a unique character. She was known to be pretty frugal with money, something that probably stemmed from when her marriage broke up in the early 40s, and her husband left her with 2 kids and no money. Millicent Fenwick eventually inherited a bundle of money when her wealthy father died, but for several years, things were kind of tight for her. So when she was in Congress, she was known to return any unspent office allowances to the federal treasury. She drove an old and very basic car around Bernardsville. and I came across one story that claimed she was reluctant to use her car brakes for fear of unnecessarily wearing them down. So her fast-moving car was a familiar sight as it sped down the hilly roads of town. In late 1991, during a period when I was unemployed and bored, and Fenwick was long retired from public life, I read something about her, and I remembered hearing that she had always kept her phone number listed in the local phone directory. So I found her address and I wrote her a fan letter. I don't remember what I wrote, but I was surprised when I soon received from her a 2-page handwritten letter on a very elegant and dainty stationery. It wasn't just a thank you for writing and good luck type of note. She'd obviously read my letter because her note to me was very personalized and very thoughtful. A few months later, in early '92, my delusions got the best of me and I wrote her again, this time urging her to write her memoirs, given her interesting life. And I offered to assist her in the process. Soon after, she wrote back thanking me for my suggestion, but telling me that she was now an old lady and didn't have the energy for such an endeavor. And she passed away a few months later. So I included Millicent Fenwick in my book for no other reason besides my longtime admiration for her and her style, and my wish that there were more people like her in public life these days.
Yeah, we were, just for those in the area, certainly know that she has a nice bronze statue over in Burnersville, across from the Berners Inn. I think I was one of the first ones, or there was me and someone else went over there. We were the first ones to put a mask on her.
Is that right?
Pandemic. So we took a bunch of pictures of not only her, but we then went up to, we thought of the idea and then we took the idea up to Morristown, and actually on the Morristown Green took some fun pictures of Washington and Lafayette wearing their COVID masks as well. So yeah, she's very highly regarded in the area.
Yeah.
Has left a legacy.
Yeah, her grandson bought a copy of my book, and he pointed out, and then I saw the statue, and it has in her pocket an outline of her pipe.
Yes, I noticed that you wrote that in the book, and I never even knew that. So I'll have to look next time we're over there.
Yeah, it was neat. I guess my favorite story in the book, in the first chapter that I actually wrote about when I started this whole thing, is the one about a guy named Mundy Peterson. He was an African-American man born in present-day Metuchen in 1824. And when he was a young boy, he and his family moved to Perth Amboy. So the 15th Amendment to the Constitution states that, quote, the right of citizens of the US to vote shall not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, African Americans now had the constitutionally guaranteed right to vote. And that amendment was formally made part of the Constitution on March 30th, 1870. I should clarify, though, it gave African American men the right to vote. No women would have that right for another 50 years. So the day after the 15th Amendment took effect, an election was held in Perth Amboy on whether to approve a revised charter for the city. And it was the first election to be held anywhere in the country after that 15th Amendment was enacted. That day, Mundy Peterson was at work doing manual labor for a Mr. Carney, who urged him to go and cast a vote. Peterson was hesitant, but after some additional prodding from two friends, he went to Perth Amboy City Hall on the afternoon of March 31st, 1870, and voted, becoming the first African American in the entire country to cast a legal vote under the 15th Amendment. Now, not everyone was as thrilled by this as Mundy Peterson, as I recount in my book. Peterson liked to tell the story of how one white man, upon seeing him vote, ripped up his own ballot, declaring that the franchise was worthless if a Negro could do it. But there is an amusing footnote to this. 9 years later, in 1879, Mundy Peterson was a candidate for city council in Perth Amboy. He lost overwhelmingly, 274 votes to 2. But one of the 2 votes he received, besides his own, was from that same white guy who had ripped up his own ballot in anger 9 years earlier. So I think Mundy Peterson's story is a great one and a really wonderful part of our state's history. Of course, this being New Jersey, there was a brief controversy over whether he had actually been the first to cast a vote. Someone in Princeton claimed to be the first, but an investigation showed that Mundy Peterson was really the first one. And I don't know if you know this or not, March 31st every year is celebrated as Thomas Mundy Peterson Day in New Jersey in recognition of his historic vote. He died in 1904, and he's buried in the cemetery at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in Perth Amboy. And right around the corner from that church stands the proprietary house, a very large, boxy, brick, Georgian-style mansion built in the early 1760s. During colonial days, it was the home of the royal governor, in other words, the King of England's appointed overseer of affairs in New Jersey. In 1762, the king appointed William Franklin to be royal governor of New Jersey. And at the time, there were two capitals here, one in Burlington in the south, in the west, and the other in Perth Amboy in the east. Franklin and his wife lived in Burlington for the first 11 years, but in 1774, they moved to Perth Amboy and lived in the proprietary house. And it's still there. It's the only one of 13 official royal governor's mansions still standing today. Now, William Franklin had a pretty famous father, and as the drive for American independence heated up, William Franklin and his father, Ben Franklin, found themselves on opposite sides of the issue. William stuck with the king, Ben fought the king, and father and son grew increasingly estranged and barely spoke to each other for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the New Jersey rebels had set up a provincial congress to challenge the authority of the official legislature that was loyal to the king. In late spring of 1776, Governor Franklin took some actions that the rebels concluded was the last straw for them. And in June, the provincial Congress declared him to be an enemy to the liberties of the country. It ordered Colonel Nathaniel Hurd, the leader of a local militia, to arrest Franklin and remove him from power, which he did after a few days of back and forth bargaining on June 19th. Hurd took Franklin to Burlington, where the members of the provincial Congress were waiting to question him. So from what I found, William Franklin was not necessarily a tyrannical governor. He worked to improve roads and build bridges. He got England to provide crop subsidies to farmers here. He encouraged the legislature to grant a charter to what would become Rutgers University. He curtailed imprisoning people for being in debt, and he pardoned 105 women who'd been sentenced to jail for adultery. But he was loyal to the king and stayed in this position when most other colonial governors, fearful for their safety, had left their post. And that loyalty sealed his fate. Franklin never regained power. The Declaration of Independence was signed 2 weeks after his arrest, and Franklin was removed to Connecticut. He was released 2 years later in a prisoner exchange, and he spent the rest of the war in New York City before moving to England, where he lived until his death in 1813. As for Colonel Nathaniel Hurd, he went on to serve as a brigadier general of the New Jersey militia during the war. The Brits took some revenge on him for his role in arresting Franklin when their troops marched into Woodbridge in December 1776, took Hurd's property and burned his house down. Hurd died in 1792 and is buried in the First Presbyterian Church Cemetery in Woodbridge. Now, many of his family members remained in the area, and some of his descendants live around here to this day. I won't bore you with all the details, but it turns out that Nathaniel Hurd's great-great-great-granddaughter, sometime in the 1870s, married James Rossi, my great-great-grandfather. Their son, my great-grandfather, August Rossi, was born in 1875. And his son was my grandfather, the first Fred Rossi. So that makes Nathaniel Hurd, who arrested Ben Franklin's son 244 years ago, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather. So that's my big claim to fame. Back in those days, I was told there was a tradition when someone died to cut a lock of their hair off, put it into a pendant and as a keepsake. And my great aunt had Nathaniel Hurd's hair in a pendant for many years, and she just recently gave it to the Proprietary House Museum. So you can see that I had purely selfish reasons for including the story in the book.
That is such a great story, John. I got to
I've heard
tell
it
you,
all my life.
here's the funny thing that you bring that up is because one, Just by you just bringing up that lock of hair story, it was really amazing. We took a group up to the oh God, what is it called? The Schuyler House up in Morristown. And there's a whole story with Hamilton there. But if you go upstairs there, they have a whole number of hair lockets
Mhm.
up there. And everybody was like, all the kids were up there like, what are those things for? And
Yeah.
evidently it was the thing to do. But then on the other note, which the point you brought up, which is very interesting that you brought that up, and we have a lot in common in this area, was I went down and visited the proprietary house as well because I was interested in the story. I was doing the research about the 5 signers of the Declaration of Independence, and it was very interesting that they were totally changed because of the arrest of Franklin, because Franklin was the one who was appointing the signers,
Right.
the commission to be able to go sign. They didn't trust him, so they basically had him arrested. Then they chose a whole new bunch of signers to go represent New Jersey and go sign the Declaration, which is why you have a different set of signers to the Declaration. But on top of that, what I also found out was strange was in this area, at the same time that they were building the proprietary house in 1760, that same exact Georgian style house, which was a 3-story concrete brick designed home, was very prominent looking if you've ever seen it. Was rated as one of the finest examples of colonial architecture in the United States at the time. That exact same builder built the exact same house on the property of a William Alexander in Basking Ridge. So there is a Lord Stirling Road, and his Lord Stirling estate was actually one of the most prominent estates and looked exactly like this proprietary house down in Perth Amboy, built by the same exact builder at the same exact time. So I found it really ironic that Lord Stirling in Basking Ridge used the same builder and had the same exact house, but nobody knows or knew what the house looked like in this area. And it was really tied. It was because of the proprietary house that they've done such a great job at trying to keep that and preserve it. So if anybody's never been there, certainly I know because of COVID, it's been closed, but every year I know they do, I think it's a reenactment of your
the whole arrest and everything.
Grandfather getting arrested. So I think it was it's an honor, I have to say. It's a historic honor, one that I certainly don't have, but a great story nonetheless, and I'm glad you included it in the book.
Yeah, I've heard about it since I was a child, and I just never knew the details of it. But yeah, it's pretty neat. You
also have a story in here. I think that one of the things that I just, when we talked yesterday, I was absolutely amazed. I'm born and raised in Scotch Plains and Westfield myself. But I think the interesting part was you have a story in here, what was called something about a president wanting to get buried at the Jersey Shore. Can you tell that's the president? It's called The President That Dies Down the Shore.
Yeah, I was going to get to that
about the Jersey Shore, but this is a story that blew me away when I read it.
Yeah, I that's about 2 more stories down. I'll touch on it because it was a very interesting one too.
Carry on then.
All right. Yeah, another interesting person who's in my book is someone named Garrett Hobart, and he's from up in Paterson. Born in 1844, very wealthy lawyer and businessman, and he was also very successful in politics. Before he was 40, he was elected first to the state assembly and then to the state senate, and served as the presiding officer in both of those houses. Very well liked and very well regarded by everyone from both parties. And after he left the legislature, after a brief tenure, he returned to his law practice and business dealings in Paterson. And he also became the power broker for the Republican Party in North Jersey. And he seemed to be happy where he was, making lots of money and being with his family. But in 1896, he had been out of office for more than a decade. In 1896, Ohio Governor William McKinley selected him as his vice presidential running mate, despite the fact that they did not even know each other. But when they did meet and when their wives met, they hit it off politically and personally. And the McKinley-Hobart ticket ended up winning the 1896 election. And Garrett Hobart quickly became the most influential vice president in American history up to that point. Now remember, until then, vice presidents were usually elected and then forgotten and ignored. And that was the case for many decades afterwards as well. I have a little summary in my book of how forgettable vice presidents were. Thomas Jefferson and Vice President Aaron Burr detested each other. The same was true of Andrew Jackson and John Calhoun. It's said that the only time that James Buchanan invited his vice president to the White House was to get his input on some words to be included in a Thanksgiving proclamation. Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president, John Nance Garner, famously compared the vice presidency to a warm bucket of spit or something more colorful. Harry Truman wasn't even aware of the atomic bomb project when he became president after Roosevelt's death. And asked at a press conference to describe Vice President Nixon's contributions to his administration, Dwight Eisenhower said, "If you give me a week, I might think of one." I found a newsreel of the inauguration parade in 1897 with McKinley and Hobart. They rode in separate carriages down Pennsylvania Avenue to the White House. And the narrator identified Hobart as the lonesome looking gentleman riding alone in a carriage and said, "You guessed it, he is the vice president." But despite that history, Hobart and McKinley worked so well and so closely together that Hobart was nicknamed assistant president. He played a key role in the Spanish-American War. The McKinleys and the Hobarts, who lived right across Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House, socialized often and even took vacations together. And as was the case in Trenton, Vice President Hobart was widely admired and very well liked and respected by politicians of both parties in DC. In fact, at a dinner, one senator told Hobart's wife that he had voted against a piece of legislation that he himself had sponsored because of the senator's great esteem for Hobart, who he knew was opposed to that senator's bill. And with Hobart was still in his early 50s, his prospects seemed pretty much unlimited. But in 1898, his health began to decline. He experienced fainting spells and breathing problems that were eventually tied to a serious heart condition. Eventually, in 1899, he returned to Paterson and announced that he would be unable to resume his political life. He died on November 21st, 1899, and thousands lined up in Paterson to go into his home to view his body. And he was given a massive funeral in town that was attended by McKinley and all the VIPs of the day. Now here's where American history comes in. This has always fascinated me. The following year, 1900, President McKinley was reelected, obviously with a new vice president. And a year later, in September 1901, McKinley was assassinated in Buffalo. Now, had Garrett Hobart not gotten sick and died, there's no question he would have run again with McKinley, been reelected as vice president, and then become the 26th president when McKinley died. Instead, who became president? Brooks, you know this answer. Time's up. McKinley's new vice president was the former governor of New York, Teddy Roosevelt. So imagine how different American history and world history would have been if a low-key and mainstream President Hobart had been in the White House in the early 20th century instead of the brash, swashbuckling, progressive Teddy Roosevelt. Someone wrote that Rutgers might instead be called Hobart University. The Hobart Presidential Library would be located maybe in Paterson, and countless highways and buildings would be named after him. So I read a long bio of him researching this book, and he was really a truly interesting and decent fella, it seemed like, and it's too bad people don't know more about him. Next story, Robert Gibbon Johnson from Salem County. and he had a alleged role in popularizing the tomato. That story goes like this. Up until the 1800s, tomatoes, it was believed by many, were poisonous. They weren't even grown in the US until the early 1700s, and only then they were used more as ornamental plants than for food, although not everyone believed the warnings. Some of the founding fathers were said to have tomatoes growing on their farms, and it's very likely that the Native Americans also ate them. So supposedly at noon on a Sunday in September 1820, Robert Johnson was said to have shocked a crowd on the steps of the Salem County Courthouse by eating a basket of tomatoes in order to prove that they were not poisonous. People were screaming, and one woman fainted at the prospect of Johnson dropping dead from tomato poisoning. So the story went. 129 years later, CBS Radio's You Are There program reenacted the scene. But lots of research by me and many others show that it's pretty obvious that the whole story is fake. While Johnson may have brought the first tomatoes to Salem County, there's no real evidence that he ever ate a basket of them in front of the crowd. Even the local Salem newspaper from that time had no mention at all of any tomato eating event. But instead, his story was expanded, embellished, and mostly fictionalized. Even the Salem County Historical Society has a version of the supposed incident on its website. But it's a fun and harmless legend, much like the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and of course, the Jersey Devil. But speaking of the tomato, if you're still arguing with people whether the tomato is a fruit or a vegetable, the United States Supreme Court took up that question in 1893. They ruled in favor of the tomato being a vegetable because the court reasoned tomatoes are consumed like vegetables as part of a main meal, as opposed to a fruit's use as a dessert staple. So argument is settled. So those are a few of those.
And I think that you even mentioned in the book that it's the official vegetable of the state of New Jersey.
Yeah. About, I think 30 or 40 years ago, the legislature designated it as that. Those are just a couple of the stories in my book. I've just given you some brief summaries of the much fuller stories of Mundy Peterson and William Franklin and Nathaniel Hurd and Garrett Hobart and Robert Johnson. You have to read the book to get the full story of the Martian invasion. I also have a chapter on what it was like having Albert Einstein as a neighbor during the 20 years he lived in Princeton. There's a story of the little girl who knocked on his door one day to ask him for help with her math homework. And another story about the absent-minded Professor Einstein calling the dean's office at Princeton, asking for directions to his own house because he had gotten lost. And I also write about his very outspoken views on civil rights in the 1940s and early 50s. Another pretty bizarre story I came across is about an Italian immigrant named Gaetano Bresci. He was a silk worker in Paterson in the late 1890s, and he was also very active in the anarchist movement there. Apparently, Paterson was the hotbed of the anarchist movement in the United States. He also kept an eye on what was going on back in Italy, so much so that when the king there ordered the massacre of hundreds of Italians protesting his rule, Gaetano Bresci was so angered by this that he quit his job in Paterson, left his wife and kids here, and returned to Italy to take matters into his own hands and change the course of Italy's history. What did he do? You'll have to buy the book and read it. I'm guessing many of you know that the Addams Family cartoons and TV show and movies sprang from the mind of Charles Addams, who grew up next door from me in Westfield. It turns out he got lots of inspiration for his cartoons and his characters from his boyhood years living there. And surprise of surprises, his childhood was not anything like the Addams Family from TV and movies. He told his biographer, I know it would be more interesting, perhaps, if I had a ghastly childhood, chained to an iron bed and thrown a can of Alpo every day. But I'm one of those strange people who actually had a happy childhood. Any Bruce Springsteen fans here, except for me?
I saw you wearing that Bruce Springsteen shirt in that picture the other day.
Oh, that's right. I've seen him
sometimes. What could a book about Jersey be without having a story about Springsteen in there somewhere?
Something, yeah.
Kind of expected it almost.
Yeah, serious fans know that the very first songs he ever recorded were with his high school band back in the mid 60s when he was 16 years old. So I devote a chapter in the book to how that band got together and what it was like that day in May 1966 when they recorded their very first songs at a recording studio down in Bricktown. Besides the story of Garrett Hobart, there's a whole bunch of other political stories in the book, which is timely, I guess, given that we're wrapping up a presidential campaign. New Jersey is certainly not the cradle of presidents that Ohio is, but our state has sent a number of presidential and vice presidential candidates out there on the hustings. Most recently, we had Senator Booker from Newark. 4 years ago, it was Governor Christie. 20 years ago, my old boss, Senator Bill Bradley, ran against Vice President Gore. It's been 108 years now since someone from New Jersey was elected president. And anyone know who that was? Woodrow Wilson, who was governor and previous to that, president of Princeton University. However, he was not born in New Jersey. Only one native-born New Jerseyan has been elected to the White House, and that was Grover Cleveland, born up in Caldwell. He lived mostly in New York State and in Washington, D.C., but he spent his first years and his final years here. Here's an interesting thing I found out about him that I did not know. Yes, he's the only president to serve non-consecutive terms, but he was the Democratic candidate in three straight elections, and he won the popular vote in all three of those elections. 1884, when he was first elected, and he won the popular and electoral vote. 1888, he lost his re-election bid, but won the popular vote. And in 1892, he was elected again, winning both the popular and electoral votes. So Franklin Roosevelt won the national popular vote 4 times, but Grover Cleveland, to my surprise, won the popular vote 3 times. And no one else has done that. And he's the only president buried in New Jersey, in Princeton, where he died in 1908. Here's a story about that Brooks was talking about. Another president who died in New Jersey was James Garfield, who died down in Elberon, just outside of Long Branch, where he was recuperating after being shot in 1881. I have a full chapter on all the very hasty preparations that were made down the shore in anticipation of his arrival. He was seriously ill and in great pain. So in order to avoid jostling him too much, a special railroad line was built overnight from the Elberon train station out to the oceanfront house where he would stay, a half a mile away. That allowed him to be transported by a train instead of by a horse-drawn carriage over an unpaved street. That was a really fun chapter to research. Speaking of famous dead people, there are a number of dearly departed famous people who are spending eternity in the Garden State. The actor Dudley Moore, he's buried in a cemetery not too far from me. Whitney Houston is in Westfield. Thomas Edison is in West Orange. Vince Lombardi is in Middletown. Walt Whitman is in Camden. Althea Gibson, the tennis star, is buried in Orange. Yogi Berra is in East Hanover. David Willens, who prosecuted Bruno Richard Hauptmann for kidnapping and killing the Lindbergh baby, is buried in Islin. And there are plenty more. There are also numerous famous people from all walks of life who were born here in New Jersey. Astronaut Buzz Aldrin from Montclair, Norman Mailer, whose birth was born in Long Branch, John Travolta, Englewood, Jerry Lewis, Newark, Jack Nicholson and Danny DeVito in Neptune, Tom Cruise, Glen Ridge, Meryl Streep, Summit, James Fenimore Cooper from Burlington. Both Abbott and Costello were born in New Jersey. And so, of course, was Frank Sinatra.
So I'll throw you one back there. You just mentioned Meryl Streep. Graduated high school in Bernardsville, actually.
Yeah.
Lived actually in Basking Ridge, just down the street from my house. A lot of people didn't know that. She went to Oak Street School before she went over to Bernardsville. And the thing that I found the most amazing about her was her boyfriend at the time was this young, aspiring musician named Jay Giles.
No way.
That was his boyfriend. That was her boyfriend in high school. It was a a Bernards High School graduate.
Wow, I did not know that one.
Oh, there you go. There's another one. And here, I want to throw you guys one more, just as I know we've only got like 10 minutes left. But one of the stories that it just continues to blow my mind. There's two. There's one that America's first military academy, 28 years before it was in West Point, was started by a General Henry Knox in Pluckeman. And it was
That's right.
called
Yeah.
Pluckeman Cantonment. Story that we refer to it as the greatest story, the greatest untold story of the Revolutionary War. And the other one, though, was another one, which is a place which is I don't know if anybody can see this. It's well, anyway, it doesn't come through really well. It was a keepsake that we made from a property in Basking Ridge called the Widow White's Tavern. And Widow White is such a great untold Jersey story because it ties into this gentleman called General Charles Lee. And if we got to go back to Revolutionary War history, the basic premise to this story is, if it wasn't for what this man did to be dumb enough to get caught at Widow White's Tavern and be imprisoned, we might still be speaking the Queen's English today. Because this guy, who was supposed to be the leader of the Continental Army and was fighting Congress, who was willing to choose General Lee over General Washington. Luckily, the Continental Congress chose General Washington. Lee got himself in trouble in December 1776, got arrested, sent down to the Virgin Islands in prison, then came back in an unbecoming prison exchange. I think they changed the general for like 2 colonels and a goat. And it pissed him off so much that evidently his career started to suffer when he finally came back to command and forced a retreat at the Battle of Monmouth. That was his demise. And the beauty of it was he was court-martialed by none other than Lord Stirling, who sentenced him from Basking Ridge. And he said on his deathbed when he was dying, "Do not bury me in a Christian churchyard, and do not bury me with these people, these Americans. I never want to be part of them again." And where did they bury him? But the front door of the First Presbyterian Church in Philadelphia. Blew my mind. What a great story. Sort of a Twilight Zone life story.
Yeah.
That was my Jersey. That's sort of my Jersey untold story. Didn't make Fred's book, but certainly a good story.
The next
Guys, I know we've only got a couple of minutes left. Is there anybody who would like to maybe come off mute and ask him a question about maybe how he put together the book or picked a story or have a story that you'd like to know more about? Maybe he's researched it or put it on his list. I'm sure he'd love to hear from you guys.
No math questions, please. No, it was a lot of fun to research. It was, a 6-month process, but I loved every second of it. I learned a lot, and it was just a lot of fun to find out. A lot of trivia, a lot of little known facts. My sister said the book helped her and her husband at their trivia night at their local bar earlier this year with some of the questions. But yeah, I mean, somebody up. I thought there was a question
they'd like to ask. Otherwise, he's right. You can, there is in the book, there is a lot of information, about factoids. There's also on the back in his references, there's a whole ton of websites that he got his information. I know like Fred, that doing the research now is a lot easier than it used to be, but it's still complicated. But there are a lot of sources.
I was amazed at how many sources there are.
Rutgers has and the state of New Jersey has worked really hard on the New Jersey Digital Highway. And I really find it, as I write stories now, most of my stories are always tied with a caveat that I post mine online and I can update them as new information becomes available, because it comes available as they digitize more things. You start finding more items to reference. So we find out more things later in life, as the digital age continues to document all these old documents over time.
I found this one interesting thing when I was researching Garrett Hobart. I found his wife, 30 years after he died, she wrote a memoir for the grandchildren just to tell them what their grandfather was like. And it was never published. It was just a private thing, but Stanford University got a hold of it and it was digitized and really fascinating to read. Just the obscure stuff you find.
So in the last couple of minutes, what I can do is I talked to Fred and he said, hey, I've got this numbers game that I play in my mind. I said, Fred, could we at least, he promised he would say, anybody that's on the call, if you'd like to get a copy of his book, he said he'd even offer you a 20% discount. I'll give you the information. I think I have it. Let me just share it on my screen here. Let me go right here. If you want to get a copy of his book, it's called Jersey Stories. You can jot down his Gmail account here. He's also on Facebook. So if you just type Jersey Stories, you'll certainly be able to find it. He's Jersey Stories New Jersey at gmail.com. Just tell him you'd like a copy. I told him that if you would like to get a copy, he'd give you 20% off. I think he even offered, he said he'd autograph it for you if you like as well.
Absolutely.
So that's great. And the other thing is I said, you got to do me a favor though, is I want to make sure that you give, we're going to give at least a copy away here. So let me stop sharing here. I want to go back to the grid. Okay. I've got, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I've got a number behind my back here. You've got no, it's you call out. I'd like you to call a number between 3 and 9. Go ahead, Fred.
4.
Between 3 and 9.
5.
Oh, someone's gonna call it for me. 5. Okay, who's Dottie? Dottie's
9.
8. 8 from Dottie.
I gave I was taking a couple of us out. I wrote it down on my pen. Dottie's iPad. We're gonna give you a free copy of Fred's book. If you want, we'll certainly reach out to you. Can you just give me your if you want, reach out to me, just give me your details and we'll make sure we get you a copy. And everybody else, I certainly thank you all for coming. Fred, I certainly thank you for your time.
It was a blast.
I'm sure it's an interesting adventure for writing a book. I give you a ton of credit. I'd love to be in that position someday, but I don't think I could do it. I don't think like you said, you were talking in the beginning of your book, how your sister, I think it was your sister, who was your proofreader?
Yeah, my sister is a professional proofreader. So
yeah, there you go, man. Any proofreader that I've ever had blows up all my writings.
Yeah, she was pretty fair.
So I certainly thank you for that. Let me see what else I had here to just share with everybody else. Just as a quote, as a motto, we always say, love your local history. And then I just wanted to thank everybody for coming today.
Thank you all.
Given that, we're going to end this show today. I want to thank everybody for coming. Thank you for your time. We've got another one scheduled for Friday night. If you're interested and you're not out causing mischief, we would certainly love to have you come join us. You can find the details on our website. Constantly look for us. We have new articles that we post all the time, new events as well. We've got a couple that we partnered with this weekend as well. There's some stuff in the area going on, and we'd love to have you guys stay in touch. So thank you very much for joining us tonight. We will call this a wrap for today, and thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.